Our time has come. The nation stands united behind our cause, ready to march forward into a glorious future.
The archival evidence reveals the horrifying truth. Speer knew the brutal reality of the forced labor camps, contradicting his testimony directly.
Senhor, tem alguma declaração? Por que está aqui agora? Olhe para as câmaras, por favor.
On the last day of the Nuremberg trials in October 1946, the International Military Tribunal announced its verdicts on the 21 defendants in the dock. 12 were sentenced to death. 3 were acquitted. The remaining 6 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. Among those sentenced to prison rather than death was Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, the man who had rebuilt the German war economy in 1942 and who had kept Germany fighting for years beyond the point at which a rational calculation of resources would have required surrender. Speer received 20 years. The verdict was, by the standards of what Speer had actually done, extraordinarily lenient. He had used forced labor on a scale that was among the most extensive of any organization in the Third Reich. He had requisitioned workers from the occupied territories and from the concentration camps. He had sat on the Central Planning Board alongside Heinrich Himmler and had participated in decisions about the allocation of labor that sent hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths in the conditions of slave labor that the Third Reich imposed on its workforce. He had visited the Mauthausen concentration camp and had seen the conditions under which the prisoners worked and lived and died. He had met with Hitler dozens of times each week for years and had been one of the inner circle of the Nazi leadership. And yet the tribunal sentenced him to prison rather than death. And yet he was released in 1966 after serving his full 20-year sentence, when men who had committed lesser crimes in the same system had been executed or imprisoned for life. And yet he published a best-selling memoir, Inside the Third Reich, in 1969 that became one of the most widely read accounts of the Nazi period, that was praised by reviewers in every major Western publication, and that established Speer as a good Nazi, the man of culture and intelligence who had served Hitler without quite knowing or without quite acknowledging the full dimension of what he was serving. The Speer story is one of the most remarkable performances of self-invention in the history of the 20th century. Over 30 years, from his first appearance in the Nuremberg dock in 1945 to his death in 1981, Speer constructed and maintained a narrative about himself that was at once largely false and almost entirely believed. The narrative was simple. He was a technocrat, the architect who had drifted into the Nazi system through proximity to Hitler, who had administered the war economy with professional competence without involving himself in the atrocities that the rest of the Nazi leadership was conducting, who had tried in the war's final months to frustrate Hitler's scorched earth orders, and had thereby made some moral amends for the service he had rendered. He was not one of them. He was the one who had not known. Historians have spent 50 years demonstrating that this narrative was a lie, and the accumulated weight of the scholarship is now so clear that the question is no longer whether Speer was lying, but why the lie was believed for so long and by so many people who should have known better. Before I tell the story of the lie and how it worked, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. The next episode is about Erich von Manstein, the German general who was arguably the finest strategic mind of the entire war, and who used that mind to help plan and execute some of the most successful German offensives of the Eastern Front, all while systematically looking away from the atrocities being committed behind his armies. That story of strategic genius and moral blindness is coming soon. Subscribe now and hit the bell. And if this episode about the most successful self-invention of the 20th century gives you something to think about, if the Speer question makes you genuinely uncomfortable, hit the like button. Back to Speer. Back to the lie that saved a life and shaped how a generation understood the Nazi regime. The broader question of why the Speer myth survived as long as it did, why intelligent historians and journalists and members of the public continue to believe the story he was telling long after the evidence against it was available, is one of the more instructive questions in the historiography of the Nazi period. Part of the answer is the quality of the performance. Speer was genuinely intelligent, genuinely articulate, and genuinely skilled at the specific intellectual moves required to maintain his position under pressure. When confronted with specific evidence that contradicted his narrative, a document, a testimony, a piece of the record that should have been known to him, he had a range of responses available. He had not seen that document. He had not received that information in a form that allowed him to understand its significance. He had chosen not to pursue the matter because he was afraid of what he would find. He deeply regretted this failure in retrospect. Each of these responses was calibrated to acknowledge enough to seem honest, while denying enough to preserve the essential narrative. The specific combination of partial acknowledgement and essential denial was more effective than either complete denial or complete admission would have been. Complete denial of knowledge would have been too obviously false. Too many documents existed. Too many people had testified to his involvement. Complete admission would have destroyed the narrative that had saved his life. The middle position, the calculated acknowledgement of specific failures while maintaining the essential distinction, was a position that his intelligence allowed him to maintain and that his audience wanted to believe. Part of the answer is also the specific cultural moment in which Speer published his memoir and gave his interviews. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period in which the Nazi period was beginning to be processed by a West German society that had been deliberately avoiding the full confrontation since the war's end. The Speer narrative, the educated man who had served the regime without understanding what he was serving, who had awakened to the horror and had tried to make amends, provided a framework for a certain kind of German self-understanding in this period. It allowed the identification with a Nazi figure without the identification with Nazi ideology. This specific use of the Speer story, the use of the good Nazi narrative as a way of engaging with the Nazi period without fully confronting it, was part of what made Inside the Third Reich such a significant cultural event when it was published. It was not simply a best-selling memoir. It was a cultural permission slip for a certain kind of engagement with the Nazi experience that the period required, and that the full truth would not have provided. The historians who challenged the narrative, Matthias Schmidt's Albert Speer, The End of the Myth, published in 1982, was the first systematic scholarly demolition of the Speer narrative, were working against both the quality of the performance and the specific cultural needs that the performance was serving. Their scholarship was correct. It was also inconvenient for an audience that had invested in the story of the good Nazi and that found the alternative, the story of the educated, cultured, professionally competent man who knew and chose not to know, more disturbing than the simpler story. The specific evidentiary foundation of the scholarly demolition is worth summarizing because it establishes the nature of the lie in a way that the summary assertions do not fully convey. The documents establish the following. Speer's armaments ministry correspondence with the SS about concentration camp labor allocation is extensive and reflects a ministry that was an active participant in the forced labor system, not a passive beneficiary. The correspondence discusses the transfer of specific numbers of inmates from specific camps to specific factories, discusses the conditions under which they will be housed, and addresses a question of what happens when they are worked to exhaustion or death. Specifically, that they can be returned to the camps and replaced with new transfers. The testimony of people who briefed Speer directly establishes that he received specific information about conditions in the forced labor system. Hans Kurl, who worked closely with Speer, testified after the war that he had briefed Speer on the conditions in the labor camps. Anselm Franz, who organized labor supply for the Junkers aircraft factory, testified that he had reported to Speer about the mortality rates among the camp workers assigned to the factory. The Mauthausen concentration camp visit is documented. Speer visited Mauthausen in 1943 and could not have failed to observe the conditions under which the prisoners were working and dying. His subsequent claim that the visit did not inform him about the systematic character of the persecution requires a specific and implausible blindness that his evident intelligence makes unconvincing. The Posen Conference question, whether he heard Himmler's explicit description of the Holocaust, is the most contested specific evidentiary question in the Speer scholarship, and it is contested in part because Speer was careful to maintain ambiguity about a specific location during the speech. What is not contested is that he was at Posen on the day of the speech, and that by October 1943, any senior Nazi official who would want to know about the systematic murder of the Jews had sufficient information available to know. Speer had not wanted to know. This choice, maintained consistently over years, was itself the moral failure that the scholarship has documented. The specific response of Speer to the scholarly demolition is itself instructive. He acknowledged, as the evidence became impossible to deny, that he should have known more than he claimed to have known. He acknowledged that he had chosen not to seek out the information that was available to him. He acknowledged a moral failure. But he maintained to the end the essential distinction, the distinction between knowing about the Holocaust and participating in it, between using forced labor and being complicit in mass murder. This distinction, maintained by a man of Speer's intelligence in full knowledge of the scholarship that had documented his participation, reflects the specific nature of the lie he had been telling. It was not a lie born of ignorance. It was a lie born of the specific knowledge of what the full truth would mean, what it would mean for his reputation, his legacy, his self-understanding. He had staked his survival at Nuremberg on a story about himself, and he was not going to allow the historical scholarship to take that story away, even when the evidence required acknowledging that the story was false. The specific human dimension of who paid the price for Speer's armaments production, the forced laborers whose lives and deaths were the human cost of production increases that his organizational genius achieved, deserves acknowledgement alongside the analysis of the lie. The approximately 14 million forced laborers who worked in the German war economy by 1944 came from across occupied Europe. They were French and Belgian and Dutch workers recruited under varying degrees of coercion. They were Polish and Ukrainian and Soviet workers taken from their homes by forced labor roundups. They were prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners in particular, who had a mortality rate in German captivity that reflected the deliberate Nazi policy of treating Slavic peoples as expendable. They were Jews and other concentration camp inmates allocated to armaments factories as a specific extension of the exploitation that was ultimately designed to end in their murder. The conditions under which many of these workers lived and worked were lethal. The combination of inadequate food, inadequate shelter, forced labor, and deliberate brutality produced a mortality rate in the forced labor system that was measured not in individual deaths, but in the systematic consumption of human beings as production input. This was not accidental. It was a specific character of a labor system that treated the lives of the workers as expendable, that was designed to extract the maximum production from each worker before returning them to the camps from which they had come. Speer organized the system. He negotiated for the workers. He set production targets that the workers died trying to meet. He received the briefings about what was happening to the workforce. He chose not to ask the specific questions that would have made the full truth unavoidable. He maintained the chosen ignorance that was the foundation of his subsequent self-exculpation. The people who died in the forced labor system did not have the option of chosen ignorance about their situation. They knew exactly what was happening to them. They could not perform their way out of it. They could not construct a narrative that would spare them from its consequences. They were the specific human beings whose specific lives were the cost of the armaments production that Speer organized, and whose deaths did not prevent him from publishing a best-selling memoir and becoming an international celebrity. That is a specific injustice of the Speer story, not the failure of the Nuremberg Tribunal, which operated under the specific constraints of its institutional mandate and the specific evidence available to it, but the subsequent 30 years of performance and self-invention that allowed Speer to escape the full moral accounting, while the people whose lives the system consumed had no opportunity to make any accounting at all. The historical scholarship has provided the accounting that Speer's performance was designed to prevent. The documents are available. The evidence is clear. The lie has been documented. The truth has been established. He was not the good Nazi. He was a Nazi who was good at appearing not to be one. The specific architectural career that preceded Speer's armaments role, the monumental buildings and the Nuremberg rally stagings and the grandiose plans for Germania, is worth examining in some detail because it illuminates both the quality of his talent and the specific nature of his involvement with the Nazi project from its early years. The architecture that Speer designed for the Nazi state was not neutral professional work applied to ideologically charged purposes. It was architecture conceived and executed as a physical expression of a specific political ideology the ideology that held that the German people were the master race, that their 1,000-year empire required a physical setting commensurate with its claims, and that the buildings of the Nazi state should express through their scale and their aesthetic the specific qualities of dominance and permanence that the ideology demanded. The specific aesthetic that Speer developed, in collaboration with Hitler, who had his own specific architectural ideas that Speer was translating into buildable form, was characterized by enormous scale, severe classical forms stripped of ornament, the deliberate dwarfing of the individual human figure in the space of the building or the plaza, and the specific use of light and darkness as architectural elements. The Nuremberg rally grounds, with their rows of columns and their searchlights creating the cathedral light effect, were designed to produce in the participant a specific emotional experience, the experience of being part of something overwhelmingly larger than oneself, of individual identity dissolved into the collective identity of the Reich. This was not architecture in the service of habitation or utility. It was architecture in the service of political manipulation, the use of space and scale and light to produce in human beings the specific psychological states that the Nazi ideology required. Speer was not a naive craftsman executing Hitler's vision. He was a sophisticated architectural thinker who understood what the buildings were doing and who contributed to the specific development of the aesthetic in ways that reflected his own creative intelligence. The new Reich Chancellery, which he completed in January 1939 after 11 months of construction, was the most significant single building of his architectural career and the most complete expression of the Nazi architectural aesthetic. Hitler received foreign dignitaries in a building designed to intimidate, a sequence of spaces of increasing scale and grandeur that led to the office where Hitler sat, having forced a visitor through hundreds of meters of deliberately imposing corridor and antechamber. The building worked exactly as it was designed to work. Foreign visitors reported feeling small, dominated, overwhelmed before they even entered Hitler's presence. This specific psychological effectiveness was Speer's professional achievement. He understood what he was doing, he did it with skill, and the results served the specific political purposes of the Nazi state. The claim that he was simply a professional architect serving his client, that the political purposes of the architecture were clients' concern and not his, was available to him in theory and was part of the self-presentation he employed after the war. It does not survive examination of the specific creative contributions he made to the aesthetic or the specific ways in which he articulated, in his own writings and conversations, the political purposes that the architecture was intended to serve. The Nuremberg rally stagings were the most theatrical of his architectural achievements, and they are also the most revealing of his relationship to Nazi ideology. The specific staging of the Nuremberg rallies, the Cathedral of Light with its 130 searchlights creating columns of light visible for miles, the mass formations of soldiers creating geometric patterns of human beings reduced to elements of a visual composition, the specific sequence of the rallies, events designed to build emotional intensity toward the moment of Hitler's appearance, was a piece of political theater of extraordinary effectiveness, and Speer was its designer. The people who participated in the Nuremberg rallies and who experienced the Cathedral of Light were, in that specific moment, subject to an environmental manipulation designed to overwhelm their individual judgment and merge them into the collective identity of the Nazi movement. This is what the architecture was for. Speer knew it. He designed it. He was good at it. The subsequent claim that he was simply an architect, that the political uses of his work were not his responsibility, is the first version of the lie that he would maintain and refine for 30 years. The architectural lie was relatively minor in the context of what came after, but its structure is the same. The separation of professional competence from moral responsibility, the presentation of himself as a man who was doing his job without full consciousness of what his job was serving. The armaments role brought this structure into direct contact with the most consequential crimes of the Nazi regime. The forced labor system that Speer's armament production depended on was not a distant or abstract fact. It was a specific operational reality that he managed, negotiated, and extended throughout his tenure as Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. The specific documentation of Speer's involvement with the forced labor system is extensive and has been made more extensive by the archival research of the past 30 years. His ministry's correspondence with the SS about the allocation of concentration camp labor to specific armaments factories is preserved in the German Federal Archives. His participation in the Central Planning Board meetings at which the allocation of forced labor was discussed is documented in the meeting records. His personal knowledge of the conditions under which the forced laborers lived and worked is established by the testimony of people who brief him directly about those conditions. The Posen Conference of October 1943 is the single most important piece of evidence about Speer's specific knowledge of the Holocaust. On October 6, 1943, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler gave a speech to a gathering of senior Nazi leaders that included an explicit description of the systematic murder of the Jewish people of Europe. The speech was recorded and transcribed. Himmler said plainly that the Jews were being exterminated, that the men of the SS who were performing this extermination were doing a difficult job but a necessary one, and that those present were the ones who bore the knowledge of what was being done. Speer claimed, consistently, that he had left the Posen Conference before Himmler's speech. The specific evidence of whether he was present or had departed before the speech is disputed, and the disputation reflects Speer's systematic efforts to create ambiguity in the documentary record about his presence. What is not disputed is that he was at Posen on October 6th and that the speech was given. What is also not disputed is that by October 1943, any senior Nazi official who had not already known about the systematic murder of the Jews had sufficient opportunities to know and had been choosing not to pursue the knowledge. Speer chose not to pursue the knowledge. This choice, the deliberate maintenance of ignorance about something he had every opportunity to know, was itself a moral failure of the first order. The specific construction of this chosen ignorance, maintained over years through the deliberate avoidance of specific questions and specific information, was the foundation of the narrative he constructed at Nuremberg and maintained for 30 years afterward. The Nuremberg defense was, in its construction and its execution, a piece of strategic thinking of the same quality as his organizational management of the armaments ministry. He identified what the tribunal needed to believe in order to spare him from the death sentence. He presented himself as fitting the specific category of defendant who had served the regime without direct participation in its crimes. He was articulate in acknowledging what had to be acknowledged and careful to avoid acknowledging what could not be acknowledged without destroying the essential narrative. The specific performance he gave in the witness box at Nuremberg has been analyzed by historians with the attention that a document of this importance deserves. It was a tour de force of controlled self-presentation, candid about specific matters, appropriately contrite about his service to Hitler, emphatic about his claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, and consistently distinguished from the other defendants by the quality of his language and the apparent quality of his reflection. The tribunal was watching a man who seemed to be genuinely wrestling with his conscience in public, and the performance was compelling enough to produce the verdict it was designed to produce. 20 years in Spandau prison, released in 1966. Memoir published in 1969. Bestseller. International celebrity of the repentant Nazi variety. Death in a London hotel in 1981. Preparing for a television interview, he served his sentence. He paid his official debt to justice. He spent 30 years performing the role of the good Nazi for an audience that needed to believe in the possibility of the good Nazi, that needed to believe that the Nazi system had contained within it individuals of culture and intelligence who had not fully understood what they were serving, who had served with professional competence, without moral complicity, who could be distinguished from the mass murderers who shared the same regime. The audience needed this story because it made the Nazi system more comprehensible. A Nazi leadership of unredeemed monsters was, in some ways, less disturbing than a Nazi leadership that contained within it men of education and aesthetic sensitivity, who were also complicit in mass murder. The Speer story, the story of the good Nazi, provided a category that allowed the Nazi experience to be understood without being fully confronted. The historical scholarship that has dismantled this story has done the world a genuine service, but has also confirmed the thing that the story was designed to obscure, that the Nazi regime was not populated exclusively by unredeemed monsters, and that the specific horror of what it did was inseparable from the participation of people of education and culture and professional competence who chose, over and over, not to fully see what they were serving. Speer was not the good Nazi. He was the educated Nazi, the cultured Nazi, the professionally competent Nazi who chose not to know what he had every opportunity to know, who served the regime with everything he had, and who then spent 30 years performing the story of a man who had not known. The performance was extraordinary. The truth was worse. that is the Speer War, the architect, the armaments minister, the Nuremberg defendant, the memoirist, the television personality, the man who built the weapons and used the slaves and lied about both for 30 years, the most successful performance of the 20th century, and a historical scholarship that eventually saw through it. Albert Speer was born in Mannheim in 1905, the son of a successful architect, and he grew up in the comfortable world of German bourgeois professional life. Educated, cultured, attuned to aesthetic quality, interested in architecture as both a technical and an artistic discipline. He studied architecture at several German universities, including Munich and Berlin, and in 1931 he attended a Nazi rally and heard Hitler speak for the first time. He was captivated. This specific fact, that a young German architect of Speer's education and background was captured by Hitler at a rally in 1931, is one of the more important details in the Speer story, because it reveals something about who Speer actually was before the self-invention began. The common narrative presents Speer as a technocrat who drifted into the Nazi orbit, who was recruited for his architectural talent, who was essentially apolitical and whose involvement with the regime was professional rather than ideological. The reality is more complex. Speer joined the Nazi Party in January 1931. Before Hitler came to power, before joining was professionally advantageous, at a moment when Nazism was one of several competing political options rather than the established orders of a totalitarian state. He joined because he believed. The specific content of his belief, how much in Nazi ideology he consciously accepted versus how much he absorbed unreflectively, is a question that his subsequent self-presentation makes impossible to answer cleanly. But the fact of his early commitment is not in question, and it complicates the technocrat narrative in ways that his memoir and his subsequent performances were carefully designed to obscure. His rise within the Nazi hierarchy was extraordinarily rapid. He completed architectural commissions to the party in 1932 and 1933, when the resources of the Nazi state were beginning to flow toward the construction of the monumental architecture that Hitler wanted as a physical expression of the thousand-year empire. He designed the staging for the Nuremberg rallies, the Cathedral of Light, the massive searchlight arrays that created the specific aesthetic of organized transcendence that the rallies achieved. He designed the new Reich Chancellery in Berlin, completed in 11 months of intense construction, and received Hitler's personal praise for what he had produced. The personal relationship between Speer and Hitler was one of the defining elements of the Speer story, and it is one that the historical scholarship has examined with sustained attention. Hitler's relationships with most of his subordinates were characterized by a specific dynamic of dominance and submission. The Führer's will against which all other considerations were measured, the subordinates' task being to identify and fulfill what Hitler wanted before it was fully expressed. With Speer, something different operated. Hitler found in a young architect a temperament he found genuinely congenial, intelligent, aesthetically sensitive, capable of translating Hitler's grandiose architectural visions into practical designs, and personally attractive in a way that the older and ideologically harder men of the inner circle were not. Hitler treated Speer with an informality and a genuine warmth that he showed to very few people. He took him on drives and discussed architecture. He shared his personal artistic visions. The dream of rebuilding Berlin as the new Rome, the city of Germania that would be the physical monument to the Nazi civilization. He told him things he did not tell others. Speer, for his part, was genuinely captivated by Hitler in a way that he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain and recontextualize. He described himself in later years as someone who had been seduced, who had allowed his aesthetic admiration for Hitler's architectural ambitions to draw him into a proximity to evil that his rational faculties should have prevented. This account, the seduction narrative, is part of the self-invention. It is not entirely false. The personal relationship with Hitler was real, and it did shape Speer's involvement with the regime in specific ways. But it is also a strategic narrative, carefully constructed to position Speer as a victim of Hitler's charisma rather than a willing participant in the Nazi project, to make him into someone who was done to rather than someone who did. The architectural career gave way, in February 1942, to the armaments role that would define his historical significance. Fritz Todt, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, died in a plane crash, and Hitler appointed Speer as a successor. The appointment was not based primarily on Speer's armaments expertise, which was minimal. It was based on Hitler's personal confidence in Speer and on Speer's demonstrated capacity for organizing large-scale construction projects. Hitler believed that the qualities that had made Speer an effective manager of the architectural program, the ability to cut through bureaucracy, to motivate workers, to find practical solutions to organizational problems, would translate to the armaments challenge. He was right. Speer's management of the armaments ministry produced one of the more remarkable economic achievements of the war. German armaments production in 1942 was significantly below what the resources available to the German economy should have supported, partly because of the bureaucratic fragmentation of the armament system and partly because of the specific inefficiencies that the Nazi political structure had imposed on economic management. Speer rationalized the system, centralizing authority, eliminating bureaucratic obstacles, establishing production targets and tracking mechanisms, and creating conditions in which German industry could apply its organizational capacity to the armaments problem without the constant interference of competing Nazi party factions. The results were dramatic. German armaments production increased substantially through 1942, 1943, and 1944, rising even through the Allies' strategic bombing campaign that was systematically attacking the industrial infrastructure on which the production depended. The specific achievement was not the defeat of Allied bombing, which Speer could not prevent, but the resilience of production system, the ability to disperse, to substitute, to find alternative sources and processes that kept German production rising even as the bombers were finding and destroying specific production facilities. This achievement extended the war. This is not a neutral statement. The armament production that Speer organized kept the Wehrmacht fighting through 1944 and into 1945, allowing the continued prosecution of a war that had already consumed millions of lives and that would consume millions more in the time that Speer's organizational genius bought for it. The specific calculation that Speer's management extended the war by months, perhaps by as much as a year, is contested but not implausible. And if it is approximately correct, the specific human cost of the extension is attributable, at least in part, to Speer's professional competence. The labor force that sustained this production was one of the darkest dimensions of Speer's responsibility. By 1944, the German armaments industry was employing approximately 14 million forced laborers, workers recruited under varying degrees of coercion from the occupied territories, prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. Speer was not the inventor of the forced labor system, which had been developed by Fritz Sauckel, the plenipotentiary general for labor deployment, but he was its primary beneficiary, and the specific negotiations between Speer's armaments ministry and the SS over the allocation of concentration camp labor were negotiations that Speer participated in directly. The specific knowledge that Speer had of the conditions under which the forced laborers lived and worked is one of the central questions of the historical scholarship on Speer, and it is a question on which his self-exculpatory narrative most directly depends. His claim, maintained consistently from Nuremberg until his death, was that he had not known about the Holocaust, that he had not known about the specific conditions in the concentration camps, that his use of concentration camp labor had been limited and had been conducted without knowledge of the systematic murder that was happening in the same camps. This claim has been comprehensively demolished by the historical scholarship of the past 30 years. The evidence that Speer knew about the Holocaust, or had sufficient opportunity to know and deliberately chose not to pursue the knowledge, is extensive. He attended the Posen Conference of October 1943, at which Himmler explicitly described the final solution to the assembled senior Nazi leadership. He received reports about the conditions in the concentration camps. He visited facilities that used concentration camp labor and could not have been unaware of the conditions under which the workers were living and dying. His response to this evidence, in interviews, in subsequent revised editions of his memoir, in the specific verbal maneuvering that characterizes engagement with hostile historical questioning, was to acknowledge progressively more while maintaining the central exculpatory framework. He knew something. He was not sure exactly what. He should have known more. He failed in his moral responsibility to find out. He deeply regrets not having pressed harder to understand what was happening. But he did not know about the systematic murder. He was not part of it. He was not one of them. The performance of this partial acknowledgement, the calculated admission of specific failure, while maintaining the essential denial, was one of the most sophisticated pieces of public relations management in the post-war period, and it was managed by a man of genuine intelligence and genuine charm who understood exactly what his audience needed to believe in order to maintain the narrative that had saved his life. The Nuremberg Tribunal's decision to spare Speer from the death sentence was influenced by several factors. The Allied judges had developed a specific category for the defendants, those who had participated in the Nazi system with knowledge of its criminal character, but without direct participation in the specific crimes of the Holocaust. And Speer had presented himself as fitting this category. His performance at Nuremberg was, by the accounts of contemporary observers, masterful. He was articulate, seemingly candid, appropriately contrite, and above all distinguished from the other defendants by his apparent willingness to accept responsibility for what he had done, while maintaining the crucial distinction between his actions and the murder of the Jews. The tribunal accepted the distinction. The historian's task, in the decade since, has been to dismantle it. Speer died in 1981 in a London hotel while preparing to give a television interview. He had spent the 30 years since his release from Spandau prison maintaining and refining the narrative he constructed at Nuremberg, giving interviews, writing books, appearing on television, managing his posthumous reputation with the same organizational intelligence he had applied to German armaments production. He died as he lived after 1945, performing the role of the good Nazi, the man who had not known, the technocrat who had served without quite understanding what he was serving. The historians who have most thoroughly dismantled this performance, Matthias Schmidt, Suzanne Willems, Adam Tooze, and others, have done so through the patient examination of the documentary record that Speer could not fully control. The documents show a man who knew, who was told, who was present, who participated, and who then spent 30 years constructing and performing the story of a man who had not known. The performance was remarkable. The documents are more remarkable. The truth is in the documents. He was not the good Nazi. He was a Nazi who was very good at not appearing to be one. That is the Speer War. The architect who built the weapons used the slaves and lied about both for 30 years and was believed. The specific legacy of Albert Speer in the historical memory of the Nazi period, the way his story has been used and misused in the decades since his death, is worth examining because it illuminates both the persistence of the myth he constructed and the specific damage that the myth has done to the understanding of how the Nazi regime actually functioned. The myth of the good Nazi, the educated, cultured, professionally competent participant in the Nazi system who was not ideologically committed and not personally guilty of the worst crimes, is one that has served specific psychological and political needs in the post-war period, and Speer's career provided the specific figure around which the myth was organized. The myth is dangerous because it misrepresents the nature of the Nazi system. The Nazi regime did not depend exclusively on true believers and dedicated sadists. It depended, for its everyday functioning, on the professional competence and the moral disengagement of people like Speer, educated people who knew enough to be useful, who were intelligent enough to see what was happening, and who chose not to see it completely because the choice not to see was professionally and personally advantageous. The specific insight that the Speer case provides about the functioning of totalitarian systems is that the most important participants are often not the ideologues, but the competent professionals, the architects and the economists and the engineers and the administrators who make the system work, whose participation is driven not primarily by ideological commitment, but by professional opportunity, personal loyalty to the leader, and the specific mechanism of chosen ignorance that allows them to participate without fully confronting what their participation produces. This insight is more disturbing than the simpler picture of a regime populated by ideological fanatics, because it makes the Nazi experience less exceptional. It makes it a specific example of a more general human vulnerability, the capacity of intelligent and educated people to participate in systems of great evil through the mechanism of chosen ignorance and professional commitment. The good Nazi myth, by presenting Speer as an exception, a man of culture who was somehow different from the true Nazis around him, obscures this more disturbing general lesson. The historians who demolished the Speer myth were not simply correcting a specific historical record about a specific individual. They were restoring the more accurate and more disturbing understanding of what the Nazi system was and how it worked, an understanding that the Speer myth had been designed to prevent. Adam Tooze's The Wages of Destruction, published in 2006, the most comprehensive economic history of the Nazi war economy, is particularly important in this respect because it demonstrates that Speer's specific economic achievements were not as unique or as central as the Speer myth claimed. The increases in German armaments production that Speer organized were real, but they were also the product of structural changes in the German economy that would have occurred under a competent minister in any event. The specific mythologizing of Speer's economic genius was part of the self-invention, the construction of an indispensable contribution that elevated his status and made him seem more central to the Nazi war effort than the documentary record fully supports. Tooze's analysis reveals a Speer who was a competent organizer but not the economic genius of the memoir self-presentation, a man who was in the right place at the right time, who had Hitler's personal support, and who benefited from structural changes in the German economy that were happening in any case. The armaments increases were real. The claim that they were the unique product of Speer's genius was part of the narrative. The specific irony of the Speer legacy is that the myth he constructed, the good Nazi, the man who was different from the rest, has served the interests of the people most invested in believing that the educated German middle class that the Nazis recruited was, at heart, different from the committed ideologues who drove the regime's most extreme crimes. This self-serving narrative has been useful not just for Speer, but for a specific German cultural and political tradition that has found the Speer myth a more comfortable account of middle-class German participation in the Nazi regime than the more accurate and more demanding account that the scholarship has established. The accurate account is demanding because it requires acknowledging that ordinary intelligence and ordinary education and ordinary professional competence are not, in themselves, protections against participation in systems of mass murder. Speer was intelligent and educated and professionally competent. He also organized a forced labor system that consumed human beings as production input. The two facts coexist. The moral weight of the second is not reduced by the presence of the first. The historical scholarship has made this clear. The myth is not yet dead. It is too useful for too many purposes to die quickly, but the documentary record is now too clear to be ignored, and the Speer performance that sustained the myth for 30 years has been subjected to the specific examination that performance deserves. He built the weapons. He used the slaves. He lied about both. He was believed for 30 years. He died in a London hotel in 1981, preparing to form again for a television audience that was still, in significant numbers, prepared to believe him. The documents outlasted the performance. The truth outlasted the lie. And the historical record that the scholars have assembled is the appropriate memorial for the people whose deaths his chosen ignorance was designed to obscure. That is the full accounting of the Speer War, the specific texture of Speer's post-Nuremberg career, the 20 years in Spandau, the memoir writing, the international celebrity, is worth examining in some detail because it reveals the specific mechanism by which the performance was sustained in the specific audience that was being performed for. Spandau prison, where Speer served his sentence alongside Rudolf Hess and Baldur von Schirach, was a specific institutional context that shaped the Speer narrative in important ways. The conditions of the prison, strict, regulated, monitored by Allied personnel, did not prevent Speer from writing. He used the smuggled notes system that has been documented by the scholars who have studied the Spandau period to develop the manuscript that would become inside the Third Reich. He was, in the specific conditions of his imprisonment, constructing the narrative that he planned to deploy when he was released. This specific activity, the writing of a self-exculpatory memoir while in prison for specific crimes, the construction of a narrative designed to position the memoirist as distinguished from his crimes, is itself a remarkable piece of evidence about the character of the man. He was not processing his guilt. He was managing his reputation. The distinction matters. The specific form that Inside the Third Reich took when it was published in 1969 reflected the choices that Speer had been making over the preceding 20 years. The choices about what to acknowledge, what to contextualize, what to omit. The memoir is a sophisticated document. It is not a simple denial of responsibility. It acknowledges Hitler's monstrousness. It acknowledges the author's proximity to that monstrousness. It is candid about specific matters in ways that give it the texture of genuine honesty. And within this texture of genuine honesty, it maintains the essential lie. He had not known about the Holocaust. He had not been complicit in the worst crimes of the regime. He was different. The specific reviewers who praised the memoir, and they were numerous and distinguished, were responding partly to the quality of the writing and partly to the specific cultural needs that the memoir served. A thoughtful, intelligent, aesthetically sensitive Nazi who had not fully understood what he was serving was, in 1969, exactly the figure that a certain German and Western audience needed. The memoir provided this figure with a specificity and a literary quality that made him credible. The television interviews that followed the memoir's publication were another extension of performance. Speer on television was a compelling figure, measured, thoughtful, appropriately regretful, capable of the specific verbal moves that made him seem more honest than he was. He would acknowledge that he should have known more, while denying that he had fully known. He would accept moral responsibility for his service, while distinguishing that service from the service of the men who had ordered and executed the murders. He was, in the television context, everything the audience of a serious documentary about the Nazi period want a former Nazi to be. The specific discomfort that watching these interviews produces, for someone who has read the scholarship, is the discomfort of watching a performance that succeeded, of watching a skilled deceiver perform for an audience that cannot see the deception because the deception is too skillful and the audience too willing to be deceived. Speer on television is not obviously dishonest. He is performing honesty, and the performance is good enough that the dishonesty requires historical scholarship to establish. The scholars who did that work, who read the documents, followed the footnotes, compared the memoir's claims with the archival record, were doing exactly the kind of patient, detailed historical investigation that the performance was designed to make unnecessary. Speer had calculated correctly that most people who encountered his story would encounter it through the memoir and the interviews rather than through the archives. He had calculated correctly that the performance would be good enough to satisfy most audiences. He had calculated incorrectly that the historical scholarship would not eventually produce a comprehensive documentary record that would make the lie undeniable. The scholars prove him wrong. The documents outlasted the performance. The truth outlasted the lie. But it took 50 years, and the myth is still not entirely dead, and the specific cultural needs that the myth served are still present in the way that the Nazi period is processed and understood. The lesson of Speer is not primarily about Albert Speer. It is about what the Speer story reveals about the specific mechanisms by which ordinary people participate in systems of mass murder, the chosen ignorance, the professional commitment, the specific moral disengagement that allows a man of intelligence and culture to organize a forced labor system that consumed human beings as a production input. And it is about the specific mechanisms by which such people construct, after the fact, narratives that allow them to present themselves as having been different from what they were. The documents are more honest than the memoir. The archives are more truthful than the television interviews. The scholars who read the documents and visited the archives and compared what Speer said with what the record showed were doing the essential work of historical accountability, the work of ensuring that the specific people who paid the specific price of his service are not obscured by the performance of the man who organized it. He built the weapons. He used the slaves. He lied about both for 30 years. The lie was believed. The documents have now established the truth. The people who died in his production system deserve the truth, and the historical record, in its patient and thorough way, has provided it. That is the Speer War, the architect, the armaments minister, the Nuremberg defendant, the memoirist, the television personality, and a lie that ran through all of them, which the historical scholarship has now definitively exposed. The specific question of what the Speer case tells us about how we should understand the relationship between intelligence and moral accountability, whether education and culture provide any protection against participation in evil, is the deepest question his story poses. The answer that the Speer case provides is uncomfortable. They do not. Speer was intelligent. He was educated. He was aesthetically sensitive. He had access to information. He had the capacity to understand what the information meant. And he organized a forced labor system that consumed human beings as a production input. And he lied about it for 30 years, and he was believed. The specific lesson this teaches is not that intelligence and education are morally neutral, that they can be equally deployed for good and evil. The lesson is more specific, that intelligence and education can be deployed by people who choose to deploy them this way, in the construction and maintenance of self-serving narratives that obscure moral responsibility. Speer's intelligence was not used to see clearly. It was used to perform the appearance of seeing clearly while maintaining the essential blindness that served his interests. This specific deployment of intelligence, the use of intellectual capacity in the service of motivated self-deception, is a mechanism that the Nazi period illustrates with unusual clarity, and the Speer case is its most developed example. He was not a stupid man who did not understand what was happening. He was a very intelligent man who used his intelligence to choose not to understand what was happening, and then use his intelligence again to construct and maintain, for 30 years, the story of a man who had not understood. The historical scholarship has done its work. The documents have been found, read, and analyzed. The lie has been exposed. The truth has been established. The people whose deaths his chosen ignorance was designed to obscure have been counted and named as best the archives allow. What the historical scholarship cannot do is undo what was done. The people who died in the forced labor system that Speer organized are dead. The lie that obscured their deaths for 30 years was believed. The cultural permission slip that the good Nazi myth provided for a generation of people who needed to engage with the Nazi period without fully confronting it was used. The damage was done. The historical record that the scholars have assembled is the appropriate response, not because it undoes the damage, but because it establishes the truth that the damage deserves. He was not the good Nazi. He was a Nazi who organized a production system built on human slavery, who knew what he was doing well enough to choose not to know it completely, and who then spent 30 years performing the story of a man who had not known. The performance was extraordinary. The documents are more extraordinary. The truth is in the documents. That is the Speer War. That is the accounting that the historical record is now definitively provided, and that is the verdict that the specific people whose lives the system consumed and whose deaths his lie was designed to obscure deserve to have recorded alongside his name. He built the weapons. He used the slaves. He lied about both. The lie has been exposed. The truth has been established. That is the Speer War. The specific scholarly community that has done the work of dismantling the Speer myth deserves acknowledgement as part of the full accounting. Historical scholarship is often invisible. The patient archival work, the careful reading of documents, the specific intellectual labor comparing claims with evidence, and it is often invisible by design, because the people who most need the scholarship to remain invisible are the people who have the most to lose from its conclusions. Matthias Schmidt's Albert Speer. The End of a Myth was published in 1982, a year after Speer's death, and its title expressed what the scholarship was trying to accomplish. The myth was not yet dead in 1982, and it is not entirely dead today, but the process of dismantling it had begun and could not be reversed. Schmidt's work was followed by Gitta Sereni's exhaustive Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth, published in 1995 after years of interviews with Speer and extensive archival research. Sereni's title was itself a diagnosis. Speer's battle with truth was the battle he fought for 30 years to prevent the truth from displacing the story he had constructed. Sereni's access to Speer, the extensive interviews she conducted with him in his final years, produced one of the most remarkable documents in the literature of the Nazi period. The record of a man who was, in his conversations with Sereni, progressively acknowledging more than he had previously acknowledged while still maintaining the essential denial that was the foundation of his survival. He acknowledged to Sereni that he had been at Posen. He acknowledged that he had heard something of Himmler's speech. He maintained that he had not heard, or had not understood, the specific passage about the extermination of the Jews. Sereni's assessment of this final acknowledgement is worth recording. She believed that Speer knew he had been present and had heard, and that the specific maintenance of ambiguity about the extent of his hearing was the last line of the defense that he could not abandon without abandoning everything. She believed he died knowing the full truth and maintaining, to the end, the essential denial. He died in 1981. Sereni published in 1995. The book is still in print. The scholarship is available. The documents are in the archives. The truth is established for those who want to find it. The specific people who paid the price of his service, the 14 million forced laborers, the concentration camp inmates allocated to his factories, the people who died in the conditions of the labor system he organized, deserve the truth. The historical record has provided it. The myth he constructed has been exposed. The full accounting has been completed, insofar as the archival record allows it to be completed. He built the weapons. He used the slaves. He lied about both for 30 years. The lie has been exposed. The truth has been established. That is the Speer War. That is the accounting. And that is the verdict that the historical record delivers on a man who organized a production system built on human slavery, and then spent 30 years performing the story of a man who had not known what he was doing. He knew. The documents prove it, and the documents outlasted the performance.